was just 15 when he sold his first crack rock on the streets of Peoria, Illinois.
Started dealing just to buy shoes and clothes and things like that, so when I went to school I wouldn't be made fun of.
Haywood wasn't some drug kingpin, but he had the misfortune of being prosecuted at the height of the tough-on-crime era.
They used 2 prior charges that I had to enhance me up to a mandatory life sentence.
It was 2002, 3 decades after President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse America's public enemy number 1.
In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
This summer marks the 50th anniversary of the so-called war on drugs. But time has shown that in many ways, that campaign was essentially a war on people who looked like Haywood.
They incarcerated poor people. They incarcerated folks of color. They incarcerated black people. That's what they set out to do, and that is what they did.
An Associated Press analysis found that between 1970 and 2000, the incarceration rates for the black and Latino populations roughly tripled, while only slightly more than doubling for whites. What started under Nixon intensified with Ronald Reagan. His First Lady, Nancy, made an emotional appeal to the nation's youth.
Say yes to your life. And when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no.
Meanwhile, the 1986 Anti-Abuse Act ushered in mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses and infamously made penalties for the possession and sale of crack harsher than for powder cocaine.
Like, our kids are struggling. Help us, help us, help us. They didn't ask for tanks.
Alton Lucas is an example of what might have happened had the system been designed to help people instead of waging war on them. The Durham, North Carolina native had offers to play college basketball, but then someone offered him a joint laced with crack, and his life turned upside down.
It confused my brain. It took away all of my priorities instantly.
He became addicted, stealing to support his habit, then stealing to fund his dealing. Lucas was in the process of robbing this store when the man behind the counter pointed a pistol at him.
He didn't pull the trigger.
He turned himself in. Lucas was facing years behind bars, but the judge agreed to a reduced sentence if Lucas successfully completed a drug rehabilitation program. At 54, he is happily married with 3 children. And best of all,
I've been sober now almost 30 years.
His felony record still haunts him, but a program called Inmates to Entrepreneurs has helped him grow his landscaping business. Lucas knows he's one of the lucky ones.
Just how many lives that were lost.
Good afternoon, everybody.
But in 2015, President Barack Obama took what he called another step forward in upholding the nation's fundamental ideals of justice and fairness.
Today I commuted the sentences of 95 men and women who had served their debt to society.
Eugene Haywood was one of them. He was released in January 2016 after serving 14 years. He moved to Texas to avoid falling in with old friends and into old habits.
I didn't want to prove Obama wrong.
Viewing it from the inside, Haywood says prosecutors have waged the war on drugs all wrong.
I don't see a visible winner in the war on drugs.
And the cycle continues. Last year, Haywood's only son was convicted of federal murder, racketeering, and conspiracy with a drug gang back in Peoria. Eugene Haywood Jr. is now serving life, plus 10 years. Alan Breed, Associated Press, Durham, North Carolina.
Right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Gulab Moussay. I'm the Community Engagement Manager for the Lions Center for Social Justice, and welcome to another virtual justice event. And this month, we're going to be discussing about an issue that affects our communities to this day, and that is the war on drugs. But before we get started, just like with every one of our events, we start off with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community, and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. So, without further ado, I'll be passing this along to none other than Miguel Bustos.
Hey, good evening, everyone. My name is Miguel Bustos, and I'm the Senior Director for the Center for Social Justice here at Glide in San Francisco. And we're so happy to once again come together as a community to ask questions and to figure out the issues that are happening in our lives. Most recently, we had a showing of the movie 13th regarding the 13th Amendment and the loophole that did not stop slavery once and for all. And so Glide is actually a part of a large coalition of people that are looking to close that loophole to really end slavery once and for all in this country. But in that discussion of the prison industrial complex, the idea of how many of our Black brothers and sisters are in prison and are being used as slave labor. And so the issue of the war on drugs, which was really the war on people, that came up as a discussion. And I'm thrilled and I'm excited that we have an esteemed group of individuals here that are community leaders and activists trying to make sense and end this war on people, otherwise known the war on drugs. And so I want to introduce Halston Chapman, who's founder and CEO of DeCirca 96. This is a cannabis distribution company based on socially responsible actions for the Black and Brown community. His focus is on social equity and the redistribution of resources in this industry through culturally relevant experiences. And then we have Norma Palacios, who's a policy associate at the Drug Policy Alliance. She is the Latinx advocate leading Drug Policy Alliance's reform work in California. Her roles and responsibilities are focused on advocating for policies and attitudes that best reduce the harms of drug use and drug prohibition. Her work is informed by her desire to end the war on drugs and to repair its harm. Then we have Brother Ray Miller, who served in the Marine Corps from 1998 to 2002 in working in data communications. He is the founder and operations of Educating Veterans About Cannabis, EVAC. He is a support specialist for our veterans. He is a graduate of Golden Gate University, where he studied counseling and psychology. And as one of his proudest accomplishments includes supporting SB 35 to restore compassion to California's cannabis culture in Oakland with the decriminalization nature of it. So I want to thank our panelists for being a part of this, for giving up of their time, but more importantly, for giving some wisdom. And so those in the audience, there's going to be an opportunity. If you could put any questions you have in the chat, we're going to then towards the end turn to the audience questions. So for our panelists, so we saw this video that gives us some sense of the history of the war on drugs. Given your work in the community, what actually is the war on drugs from your perspective, experience, and opinion? How do you see it? Halston, if you don't mind starting.
Yeah, thanks for asking. I understand the war on drugs from my position, like currently, as resistance to empire, right? I think that the empire has always been threatened by Black and Brown communities. We've been taken from our land's been taken from us. And I see cannabis in particular as a parallel to the traditions, to the culture, to the impact that our communities have when we're connected to our ancestors, when we're connected to our culture, when we're connected to our traditions. And Black and Brown communities have always been and existed as one of the biggest threats to said empire. And I think cannabis has too. It's always been one of our, one of our secret weapons. So to keep us disconnected from one of our medicines, one of our traditions that has, we've been with for centuries, if not millennia, to keep us disconnected from the power of that plant has been to the benefit of empire, right? So to criminalize our existence and our relationship with these substances is, yeah, it's paramount for empire to continue to recreate itself, to continue to fragment us, to continue to oppress communities, to continue to create and generate capital. So I understand the war on drugs, and particularly with cannabis, so I think it's a twofold discussion, because there are substances that are on, substance one scheduling that we have a different relationship to in our communities, that have a different impact. But in particular, with cannabis and other, some things like psilocybin mushrooms, those medicines are our power, right? And I think that if we're not able to be in touch with our power, not by accident, not by happenstance, but by design and intentionality, that speaks to something happening more fundamental, and that continues to happen.
Thank you. Norma.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with what Halston said, and you, even Miguel, right? You said it. This war is a war against people, right? It's and I would just say that this is a racialized war, right? If we looked at history, we see that the first anti-drug policies were built to target and criminalize people of color, right? Starting in the 1870s, targeting Chinese Americans here in the state of California. Then in the South, in the 1900s, making cocaine illegal because Black men were using this substance, right? And then soon after that, in the 1930s, Mexican and Mexican Americans were criminalized for marijuana use, right? And all of this were intentional decisions by the government, right? To criminalize, surveil communities of color, to eject people who were not wanted in society. And because of these drug policies, there's a lot of hysteria around drug use even today, right? If a person needs and wants treatment, it's not for him or for her, is not able to access that in her own community, right? It's really hard for people to access services that could keep themselves safe and their families, right? And even though data tell us that that Black and brown people, they use drugs at similar rates than white folks, right? And so this war really it's a tool to control communities of color.
Norma, thank you so much for that. Ryan, your thoughts on this?
Hey, these are really two tough panelists to follow. So thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. Yes, Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, teaches us that the war on drugs is the war on people, specifically Black and brown people. And so, our perspective from the military veteran perspective is the war on drugs has also been a source of moral injury. Because veterans have been the enforcers of this drug policy, throughout the global South specifically. And now we're coming back home and we're learning about the cannabis and we're learning about the mushrooms. And it's really, we're forced to reconcile this. And there's like a sense of institutional betrayal, right? We signed up with good intentions. We raised our right hand, we joined the military, and then we were used in a way that is unjust. And that's why we're experiencing the suicide rates that we are. That's why we're experiencing the substance abuse rates that we are, because it is this moral injury from enforcing the war on drugs.
Yeah. It's fascinating because I have, I'm Mexican American, Chicano, and a lot of my friends are indigenous folks from the US, but also in Latin America. And I've always was curious, how did we get something that has been medicine, right? Something that many indigenous communities throughout the world have used as medicinal. And then all of a sudden it became illegal, right? And how did that happen? Now there's some legalization of it, but there was so much harm in the interim. how did that, do you all know, how did that happen? Who,
Yeah, I mean, I think, this goes back, right, to finding ways to really target and surveil our communities. Like you said, like substances like marijuana, right, cannabis, coca, right. These were all substances that were previously used by indigenous communities. But now, because of this, drug war hysteria, those are heavy criminalized and used as a tool to keep arresting our community members, to prosecute them, right, to surveil them. The substances now are used as an excuse to take kids away from their parents.
Yeah.
And like you said, like it really doesn't make sense, right? Like almost, because like these substances were used by previously by our communities, and now these substances are there's so much stigma around, right? Like in the Latino community, right? Some of us, it's just, we see people like using marijuana, and it's like, oh, we have, there's a stigma and judgment around that.
yeah.
And if people knew that, previously, like people used to use this substance, right, for recreational purposes.
Well, what's fascinating is that, at Glide, we have a whole harm reduction series of programs to help people, those who want help and who sort of, we're there for them. And there's such a crackdown on people on this so-called war, but yet we also have people who come to Glide that became addicted because of they had an operation and they were in the hospital, and the doctor kept prescribing Oxycontin and got them into this spiral, right? And some of my family members, that's happened to them. And yet the war on drugs is not about the doctors, right? It's not targeting those who are intentionally prescribing these opioids. And recently, our city attorney, David Chu, and others have gotten together to actually sue some of the pharmaceutical companies who have been pushing these pills. I just find it amazing that the attention is on people versus the perpetrators that are really hurting our communities. Ryan, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's why they came up with the term marijuana, was to avoid alerting physicians because they've been prescribing cannabis prior to prohibition. And so, the truth is that physicians in Western medicine don't have great options for pain management because we don't embrace other things like cannabis and other holistic approaches. That's why I'm excited that, with the cannabis normalization, with things like ketamine also is growing in popularity, so that doctors can offer options beyond opiates for pain management, because it is really difficult. And really, there's been spikes in opiate usage throughout the history of this country, and they're associated with every war, starting with the Civil War. And in each occasion, the technology to deliver these opiates has improved. So the military and war in general is a great kind of catalyst for these policies.
Halston,
Miguel, I wanted to speak to your first question about like how we got here from indigenous and essentially indigenous folks using these substances as medicines to this period of criminalization that we've been experiencing for the last 51 years and probably longer. I mean, Tupac told us in the 90s, right? He said, instead of war on poverty, they got a war on drugs so the police can bother me. And it's not so much for the question isn't so much for me how, right? But the more fundamental question is why. And we look at it even happening like at Lake Merritt in Oakland, where I live, for example, where I operate. And it tends to be, okay, what are these communities doing over there? What do they do to thrive? What do they do to heal? What do they do to celebrate? What do they do to cope? What do they do to celebrate each other? And it seems like empire tends to look, whether it's at the local level, federal levels, state level, corporate level, it tends to look at what we're doing, our lifestyles, and make those things illegal. And at Lake Merritt, it's, you see it happen over the last however many 5 or 6 years: barbecuing, dominoes, cards, music, things that we do to really to be in our bodies and to be in our communities. Those things have recently become considered nuisances, and they've been prohibited. So it seems like, whether it's like, just to go back, what we use to ground ourselves, whether it's coping mechanisms like coca or cannabis or whatever the substance might be, it looks like that's what's happening there. And not to mention, obviously, as we know, the free labor, the prison labor that they get out of out of criminalizing us and funneling us into cages like that. That labor is, going back to what you were speaking on, Michelle Alexander's book and the 13th, and that's all there as a motivator, as not only a motivator, but a fundamental value of this system that we're all kind of navigating and somewhat entrenched in.
It's fascinating because, again, going back to the fact that there's so many people that have been hurt during this process or during this period. I was talking to Guled when we were thinking about this discussion, and I said, it's interesting when folks of color do stuff, when they're sort of being entrepreneurs, it's looked down upon. And I use the examples of, remember the taco trucks in the early days? People call them roach coaches. People look down on them, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, now there's this whole food truck movement, right? So it's like something is bad when folks of color are doing it, but then it becomes gourmet, and now it's like the greatest thing. Mm-hmm. But yet, how much business did people lose? How did, whether it's, people just look down upon, like if you went in those early days, oh, why do you go to that roach coach? And now all of a sudden people realize those roach coaches are actually really good food. And it's, and now there's this whole industry around it. It's almost similar to so many people we know that were put in jail for using it or selling it, but mostly a lot of those folks that I know that I grew up with got in jail for using it. And then all of a sudden it became something that other folks liked. And now there's an industry around it, but yet people are now in jail today because of that. Yeah. It's just, it baffles my mind. And I don't know, that's maybe not a question, but it's more of a comment that I think about. Because it's always about not only what you do, but how you do it and why you do it, as you said, Halston, but the pain that happens in the wake, right, of people being put in jail, disrupting family life, and for what? For a failed policy on the war on drugs. And yet we still continue today to support that, which then supports the prison industrial complex, which still promotes slavery. Anyway, I'm going to shut up with my commentary. So why do you think then is it important to educate people about this war, about its failed policies? Why do you think we should be even having these type of discussions in such a very broad and also open arena as the internet, right? And this is all going up on Glide's website, but because many of our clients are suffering, we felt it was important for us to have this discussion. So why do you think it's important to talk about this?
I can just, jump in here. I think that, like you said, right? People need to be aware, right, that this war is not over, right? That this has happened for 51 years, And the impact is, like you said, right? People swept into the criminal justice system, right? And not only that, because it's not enough for a person to serve time because of a drug offense. Once they're released because they have a drug conviction, they're not able to access public housing, right? Employment, and not even mention the immigration consequences if you're a non-citizen. People need to be aware, right, that this is happening, that this is impacting our communities, right? We have an overdose crisis, right? Nationwide, about more than 100,000 people have died, right? And people, sometimes, and I see this, doing policy work. I see this played out in the legislature. There were bills that were introduced, to address the overdose crisis. But to do that, the intent was to step up enforcement. The bills that would add sentence enhancements, right? Bills that would increase the penalties for possessing substances like fentanyl, right? Bills that would, we need drug education. Well, you need to collaborate with law enforcement, right? Just bills that would not solve the overdose crisis, right? People need to think that need to be educated to see that drug use needs to be treated as a public health issue, right? People need resources. People need support systems in their own communities, right? The reality is that the majority of people who use substances do so in a non-problematic way, right? There's a small percentage of people that would eventually need treatment, right? And for that percentage of people, we need to make sure that if they want treatment, they know where to go. They know how to access that. But at this time, because the government is investing on enforcement first approach, people are dying. People are pushed into risky situation. Fentanyl has infiltrated our drug market, right? We have a contaminated drug market because we're not able to regulate the substances. So people need to be aware how how the drug war has really infiltrated every aspect of our life, because the drug war doesn't stop once a person is arrested, right? It has really contaminated every civil system in our lives.
Yeah. We see a lot of people, many of our clients, and thank God for our safety team and many of our staff that know how to use Narcan, because we've literally saved people live. I mean, on the fifth floor, and there was a person who was blue, and our safety team came and just brought them back. But it's real. And part of our quandary that we feel at Glide is that first of all, at Glide, there's no judgment. Those who come, we're glad you're there. We're glad you want to come to Glide and you trust us, and that you know that we're going to be here for you no matter what. No questions asked. That's because we value people's lives, right? We value the people who come to Glide to have a meal because they don't have any food. And we say, you are worthy. You have dignity. Come. Same thing with people who are using that come to us and need, supplies. At least that tells us that they're watching out for themselves, right? But we're seeing the fentanyl just hit the streets, and so many people, more people are dying of fentanyl during the height of COVID than of COVID, right? In the streets of San Francisco. And it's insane that people just look the other way. And we're like, no, they matter too. Those are our sisters and brothers. They matter. They're valued. Their lives are valued. But it's I don't know. It's amazing. It's heartbreaking, really. Ryan, Halston, do you have any comments on this to add to Norma's?
Yeah, I mean, speaking on fentanyl, like in the last 6 months alone, I have a niece and a younger cousin who both overdosed. I mean, gracias a Dios, they didn't they didn't die, but Narcan was a crucial resource there to kind of resuscitate them and to reground them. So it's a lot. It's a lot happening. And I want to ask Norma, like as far as as far as the narrative goes, as far as the research goes at your organization and the networks that you're a part of, because I look at my family and I understand substance abuse to be proportionate to trauma, and I look at the trauma that within my own family, within my community, and it looks proportionate, right? There's this amount of, like, there's this level of systemic trauma, and there's this level of attempt to medicate, right, to cope, to feel okay, right? And so, like, is there a correlation or a narrative that frames substance use as a trauma response? And if so, or if not, how can we get that conversation started? Am I off base by asking that? What's the talk happening in spaces that you're a part of?
Yeah, I think that, that's totally, that's part of the conversation, right? Because when we start normalizing, right, or like normalizing substance use, we need to start, we start to have conversations about why, right? Why are people, like you said, self-medicating, right? What's behind that? What's the driving force, right? A lot of people do so, right, to, like you said, like post-trauma, right, as a coping mechanism. There's people that just, do so recreationally, right, once in a while. And they could be like doing it on a Thursday night, but then like on Friday, they're awake and they're doing their work, right? So that's something that it's definitely part of the conversation, right? And I believe that with drug education, that needs to be part of it, right? When we're having conversations, we need to really start explaining, right, the reasons of why people are using substances, right? And if it's post-trauma, then making sure that they are that their access to counseling services, right, therapy services that are culturally specific in language, right, so people can relate, can understand, and also making sure that we are learning from those with lived experience, right? Centering their voices, making sure that we are learning from them, because their journey is gonna eventually help destigmatize the conversation.
Yeah, Ryan, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, no, this is really important. I'm glad you brought up trauma, Halston, and I think the other side of this is the perpetrators of trauma. So in the military veteran experience, right, a lot of the substance abuse comes to fill in those voids that are caused by perpetrating violence, and especially unjust violence. And so thank you for this important conversation about, like, sure, substance abuse is a problem, but what's the root of these problems? And that's the important question.
It's interesting. Alicia Gonzalez said, dig up the root systems and address and treat the rot. Right. And I love all of you have alluded to the fact that the question of why does someone either feel the trauma, or why does someone feel that things are not going well for them? I always say we have to look around. How are we treating each other? Right. If someone is feeling isolated and alone, and they're turning to substance abuse, then shame on us as well, right? Mm-hmm. That we as a society have made people feel alone, that we've made people feel in some way that they're not worthy. And that's something, again, we constantly at Glide are trying to let people know that they are worthy and that we're going to walk with them on this journey. Here's a question for all of you. And again, for the audience, anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat because this is going to be a good conversation. Say I'm a conservative legislator, right? How would all three of you convince me that I need to listen to you and walk down this journey with you. So pretend I'm one of them. How would you convince me? Because this may be helpful for those who are watching this either today or in the future, who may have either family or friends that may not understand, but maybe you could provide some insights by doing this role play of saying, hey, Miguel, this is why you should do it. So who would like to start first?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this, just given our line of work, right, doing policy work is something that we have to talk to reach across the aisle, right, and have these conversations, and while we bring them along, right, bring them along along our journey as well, and in my perspective, I would just start by talking about how much money we're investing in incarcerating a person, right? It's just a huge amount, right? Versus providing the treatment services that a person needs, right, in their community, right? And what's the difference there, right? What's more cost effective at the end of the day, right? It's making sure that people have the access and resources in their own community that are voluntary, right, for a person to like if they want and need it, they're able to acquire those, right? And I would also just center the experiences of a person, right? Making sure that they are aware that because we need to start humanizing the issue, right? People just think that like you said, right, like making sure that just because a person is in this state of using substances, right, it doesn't mean that they're worthy less. They should be given the same respect and dignity as anyone else, right? And they should be given the support that they need until once they're ready to take that extra step, right? And yeah, I mean, I would just share the stories of people, right, of why are they using substances, right? What's the support that they need, right? There have been surveys that have been done that that really ask people who are using substances, right, those at the intersection of houselessness and drug use, right? And what they said is that I want support systems. I want to access a center that is welcoming, that is non-judgmental, right? So these are things that people are asking for. Why are we not investing in those, right? That's a better investment than just putting a person behind bars and then adding that extra collateral consequences for preventing them from really from their life in the future.
Yeah. Halston?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Just to kind of circle it back to what I was saying about seeing my advocacy at this point in my life as resistance to empire. Like my big homie, he always said, dig where you stand. And wherever you stand is a good place to dig, as opposed to X marks the spot. You got to make impact over here and impact over here. So starting this company within the legal market, I felt a mix of emotions. It contrasted with my values, because in the spirit of that resistance, I've always, not always, but as I came to know, in particular, cannabis, weed, tree, herb, what we call it in my home. I came to know that plant, and it shaped my life financially. It shaped my self-reflection. It shaped my social circles in a lot of ways. So the impact of that plant in regards to my life and the folks around me, that has been, it's been a big impact. And to say, I guess to answer your question, I had a lot of mixed emotions, like I mentioned, around legalization, and because preserving the plant and keeping it away from empire, right, has been, I've seen me and risk, and the folks that I've worked with, we've risked our freedom, we've risked our livelihood every day to distribute these plants, to get it to where it needed to be in communities, in space, in cities, across the country, across the world. And because we believe in it, I came to know it like substantially. And so in looking at that, and then coming into the space, the legal space, I had a lot of apprehension in allowing Empire to wrap its flag around this plant that has been so substantial and keeping me grounded personally, keeping people within my periphery grounded, healthy, not to romanticize the plant, but it's impacted us in ways that are still, being counted up, and ways that will never be counted up, right? And yeah, I guess I have a complex of emotions around that. So I kind of like want to keep it within, keeping it in the underground was really what I wanted to do. The first time, 2 times it came on the ballot in California, I voted no against it. And then I came into a space where like, all right, I've risked my life getting this plant to where it needed to be for a decade. I'm not going to let some corporate board member come in and take over, and someone who's probably stigmatized and talk mad shit and voted against and put us in bad positions, like from a community perspective, come in and be at the helm of the industry. So I said, all right, got to bite the bullet, and I came into the legal space, and it's still kind of funky. And there's still a lot of ways in which the industry, the legal market is forced with the narrative to pit us against the black market, the traditional market. And I try to resist that because it's kind of like, so I'm not sure if that answered your question or not. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the matter.
Before we get to you, Ryan, I just want to piggyback on what Halston said. You didn't want the industry to wrap its arms around it, but don't you think that's what's happened though, right? I mean, now we have an office within the state's administration focused solely on cannabis. In San Francisco, there's an office in City Hall that is on cannabis. And you have a lot of, and I know there's some tension between between groupings of black and brown folks and say white corporate folks who are now getting into it. That's happening though, right? And I'm sure you see it.
100% it is. And it's an unresolved contradiction. It's at every turn. It's like one of the Yelp of cannabis is weed maps, right? And so there was a big push to buy legal operators to get traditional or quote unquote black market operators off of the platform because we couldn't compete with their prices. And so Weed Maps kind of initially took like a laissez-faire stance against it and said, hey, we're just a platform. And then I think the Department of Cannabis, it was called the BCC at the time, the Bureau of Cannabis Control, served them with a subpoena to essentially force all of these operators off. And it was right when I was kind of coming into the space, the legal space, and Weed Maps isn't cheap, right? And so the overhead that comes with operating in the legal space, whether it's like I'm in my office space now, and it's we pay the zoning around cannabis property is very particular. It's redlined, it's gerrymandered, and we pay sometimes up to $14 a square foot for a cannabis space, right? And the overhead with that, the taxes that are imposed onto us, we're trying to dig where we stand, carve out space, and then we look over at the legal market and they're on Weed Maps right next to us and they're just buying a pound and breaking it down, and we're getting lab tested and surety bonds and all of that, and our margins are thin, right? So there's this kind of like horizontal violence that's kind of imposed on us between legal operator and black market operator that is really out of pocket, and it's really tragic in the fullest sense of the word, right? But it's not by accident, and it's like I mentioned, it's an unresolved contradiction, and it hurts. It hurts everyone involved. It hurts small equity operators or non-equity small operators like myself, and it hurts folks that are still protecting the plant, you know what I mean, that are still grinding it out and not wanting, you know, pushing back empire and keeping them at arm's length. It hurts folks riding, you know, the fence like me, who are trying to straddle, you know, both worlds and both consciousnesses about it. And at the end of the day, it hurts everyone because, yeah, I mean, the quality of the plant, everything's suffering because of it. So these offices, whether it's Department of Cannabis, whether it's you know, what's happening at the city level, those contradictions are very apparent within walking in those spaces and conversations from the first few minutes. So I'm not sure what the answer is. I don't think there has been one developed, but it's definitely a crucial conversation to have because it's not really getting any better. It's getting more stratified, to be honest.
Right. No, thank you. Now, Ryan, so I'm a conservative, right? Quote unquote, right? Tell me, why should I follow your path? Why should I help you out?
This is a fantastic question because it invites us to put ourselves in the perspective of the other, you know, and it's not that hard for me because, you know, when I got out of the military, I was a conservative. Most folks are in the military, but then I took a sociology class at Chabot College on the GI Bill by Professor Salinas. So shout out to Professor Salinas. And so, you know, that's what we learned with SB 34 and passing the, you know, compassion in California cannabis, is that veterans were crucial to shifting those conservative policymakers to the right side. And so I'm really excited, you know, for veterans to like lean more into advocacy, lean more into activism. We're really important, whether it's, you know, the front lines at Standing Rock when we went out there, or whether it's here, you know, against police brutality. And then in the halls of legislature, the veteran voice is important. And so I think it's a great like mental health solution also, right? Yeah, there's a lot of injustice in the world. Yeah, there's a lot of oppression in the world. And that can cause us a lot of despair, and that can cause us a lot of depression. However, if we're involved in advocacy, if we're involved in, you know, activism to, you know, affect change, I think that's a you know, fantastic mental health strategy. So to that conservative policymaker, it's about, you know, reducing the veteran suicide rate. It's about, you know, liberty and just freedom and, you know, just business and commerce and capitalism. If you want to talk about, you know, that stuff to a conservative.
All right. So maybe y'all are convincing me. No, it's important because, you know, I know at Glide, we have so many different types of people that come to Glide that we're always trying to say, well, look at it from different angles, right? And how do we understanding how people think and what they may be thinking about it only informs us in a better way, right? It helps us be able to do it. We have a couple of questions from the audience that I want to throw out there. We have one. What are your general thoughts on politicians also being stakeholders in cannabis companies? Do you think that should or shouldn't be allowed? Similar to the oil industry. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think like, ain't that America? You know, isn't there the revolving door from legislation to industry, whether that's in the defense industry or the energy industry? It's, you know, common to go from being a, you know, a board member, a C-suite board member, to being a, you know, government policymaker.
But is it right? Is it good? I mean, right now I know that there's a bill being proposed in the House, on the House side of Congress, that members of Congress should not own stock because, as we've been seeing, they have insider information, right? So do you think it's, you know, you're saying it's America, but is it just?
Well, is America just?
Oh, well, see, that's another that's another discussion that we're gonna have down the line. All right, Glenn?
It's consistent. It's
yeah,
consistent with America, essentially.
Right. Yeah.
That begs the question. That begs the question whether the war on drugs is a failed war. I mean, that's the name of the event. But what are the intentions? What are the intentions behind the war been, right?
Okay.
And I think if you have a decades long campaign with certain interests and certain objectives, and you brand that campaign as whatever you want to call it, whether it's a war on drugs or war on terror, and you accomplish your objectives during that period, and that thing still exists after that period, I don't know. I think if the war on drugs was designed to fragment communities, to criminalize people, to imprison people, to disrupt mental health, to disrupt home stability in our communities, Black and brown communities, indigenous communities. If it was for that, even though that's not what it was branded as, if it was for that, it was a success, right? That's that whole conversation around is the system isn't broken, right? But it's designed for certain things. There's certain pressure valves that are put there to kind of keep things the way they are. And it's my personal intuition and personal like self wisdom that that's what this war has always been about. And I think all of us have kind of been saying the same thing on this panel. So to speak particularly to a certain politician or set of politicians now being poised to participate in an industry that's been criminalized for decades, now that it's ready to become, above board, so to say. I think that, to what the brother Ryan was saying is like, is America just? And that fundamental question should reshape that question, because it's, what the sister Angela Davis said, to be radicals is simply grasp things by their root. So we could ask a question like that, or we can look at a more radical root approach stance that would make a question like that, I don't want to call it obsolete, but it would significantly reframe it.
Thank you, Halston. Norma.
Yeah, totally in agreement with what has been said, right? If this drug war, really we have to look at, is it totally a failure, right? But if the intent was to criminalize our community members, then for certain people it has been a success, right? And that really, I think that seeing it that way really opens our perspective, right, in terms of what are we facing, right, and the obstacles that lie ahead, right, to make sure that we are repairing the harms, right, we are addressing the needs of our people, but when it comes to really looking at whether or not certain people need to be part of the industry, right? We have to really also think about what's happening, right? Like, are the people that have been disproportionately impacted by the drug war, are they able to benefit from the legal market? And if the answer is no, then I think that certain people shouldn't be part of the industry and benefit from something that really they other people should be benefiting from in the first place.
Yeah. All right, we have another question. This is regarding fentanyl. What strategies should be used to deal with the fentanyl cartels in San Francisco? Are there alternatives to policing and prisons? How do we intervene with young adults being drawn into the illicit drug trade? So there's a couple of questions in that. Yeah, Norma?
Yeah, I'll just try to answer some of those questions, really good questions. So, when talking about, people who have been drawn into this illicit market, right, we also have to stop and think why, right? What's the reason behind it? Are they being provided with enough support, right? Job training, how is that accessible, right? Are they able to have a support system that it's really, motivate them to seek a higher education, or put them in a path that to better their future, right? And also this drug war, it's really using policing, right? as a way to surveil our communities. So much of that is spent on surveillance that police don't really have a lot of resources focusing on violent crimes, right? Crimes that really cause more harm than targeting people for drug possession or for drug use, right? Or for other crimes. So in terms of strategies, we really have to think about we really start looking, right, how we are investing, how much are we investing in surveillance and targeting our community members, right? And what can we do instead of that, right? Which is investment in services, investment in harm reduction services, investment in treatment, investment in counseling, right? Investment in making sure that youth have access to resources.
That's all good. Were you done on that question, or you reading it?
Yeah, no, I was just pausing to see if people had reactions. But yeah, I mean, we have to really look at investments in our communities.
No, amen to that. Halston, Ryan, your thoughts?
You can go ahead, Ryan. I'm learning from what y'all are saying.
This is great. I'm learning a lot too, man. You guys are doing a great job. I think, yes, the war on drugs has definitely targeted communities of color, Latinx campesinos and Black jazz musicians specifically, but it was also intended to disrupt the anti-war movement. We couldn't criminalize hippies and the anti-war protesters, but they could criminalize cannabis. And so it's a similar question, right? How do we give the youth different alternatives beyond drugs, right? It's similar. How do we give youth different options beyond joining the military? Because the prison industrial complex and the military industrial complex intersect in the same low-income communities. And so, if we want to disrupt the drug war, and disrupt youth involvement in the drug war, we also got to look at just disrupting war in general. And whatever, the US government is declaring war on, we should maybe look at that a little bit closer. What's behind that? What's the incentive? And is empire, is colonization the incentive behind that?
Thank you for that, Ryan. Halston, you have any thoughts on that? Or you want me to go to the next question?
Yeah, we can move on.
All right. Now here's a question. It says, this is going to be interesting. What are the solutions to get people off hard drugs? People are on hard drugs are not good. So we've been talking about cannabis, right? But there's a range. So what are some of the solutions to get people off hard drugs? Okay, now there's
I think the question would be, what's a hard drug, right? What is that?
Okay.
I think that, with the scheduling, right, of substances, right, we see that marijuana is a Schedule 1 at the federal level, right? That really imposes harsher penalties, right? But is there any science behind to back that up, right? Is that the science? I don't think that it does, right? And so we really need to stop and think a bit about why are these drugs even considered hard drugs, right? Like even like cocaine, right? Like why is that so much stigma around these drugs?
Fair enough. Yeah. Ryan, you look like you wanted to say something.
It's a really great question, and because of the scheduling system, it's interesting how plants and fungus has been included with things that are synthetic or hard drugs. But what this psychedelic renaissance is kind of inviting us to consider is drug exceptionalism, and are plants and mushrooms like somehow superior to cocaine or heroin, right? And like Norma said earlier, most drug use isn't problematic. And so can we give folks that do enjoy hard drugs, can we give them safe injection sites, testing so that their drugs are clean and pure? I think these are the questions. And then, yes, then we look at, why are people using drugs? What is that void we're trying to fill? How are we trying to feel better?
Thank you. Halston.
Yeah, it kind of points me back to something that you said earlier, right? Is like you said, I think you said like shame on us for folks feeling, can you remind what you said? Shame on us if people are lonely and are feeling so alone that they feel compelled to are drawn towards quote unquote hard drugs. What was that you said earlier?
Something in the fact
Miguel?
that why do we as a society make people feel, and it's not a judgment issue on the person, it's just it's a value judgment on us as a society, because we bully people, we socially isolate people, we judge people, and we make life hard for people, right? And so that was the impetus around what I was saying about that.
I hear that, and yeah, I mean, Ryan kind of touched on it earlier when he said, well, I mean, when you finished up with why are people being drawn to these substances, and I think, you know, if I'm being honest, I think that alienation, loneliness, hopelessness, feeling senses of purposelessness or overwhelmed. I think there's kind of an individual angst and anguish that folks are feeling, and that's not data based. That's experiential knowledge that I carry. And one of the things that we're doing at DeCirca 96, for example, we're developing an app called Squad, and what it does, it allows cannabis consumers to essentially purchase together. And it might sound very elementary because I look at a lot of like DoorDash apps and Uber Eats apps, and they all have like a group purchasing aspect to it as well. But I look at cannabis and what its potential is to create orbits, to create ciphers, to create circles. And this was all kind of being developed during the pandemic, but I think it's still very relevant post-pandemic and in general. And what I was trying to address in developing this program was allowing people to utilize their social networks to connect, to collaborate, to build, to save money, right? And so it's like, all right, if you buy your eighth for $50, and then you have an hour to go recruit folks in your network, or to hit your group chat, or to holler at your roommate, or to holler at your folks, and you're doing that not just for the sake of doing it, but you're doing it for financial gain in some way. And I think that, you know, Marx, he said in one of his writings that in capitalist society, all social relations are facilitated by commodities, right? So if I want to link with you, I can't just say, hey, Ryan, can we spend time? Hey, Norma, can I be in space with you? I got to be like, hey, you want to grab a drink? Let's go to a show. Let's grab a coffee, happy hour. You know, there's always a commodity at the center of our social relations. And I think that that's tragic again, that we, you know, have been, our minds have been colonized to associate to each other through materials and commodities, but also dig where you stand, right? Use that knowledge, use that conditioning, and allow it, and marry it with technology, and allow it to have, give us an excuse to connect. And I think that that's a place to start for me, is our sense of alienation in capitalist, you know, late stage capitalism is, even just eye contact with someone is a lot, right? So how can I use the resources I have, the ideas that I have, to give us opportunities to connect? And I think that's a place, because it addresses the why, right? It addresses why are people wanting to do hard drugs. And I think sometimes a beer and a blunt's not enough. Some people really are going through it, and they want to inundate, and they want to take off that edge, you know? And so they need something that's gonna soothe them, or allow them to look away from their distress and their anguish. And I think if we address why people are feeling that disconnected from their own bodies, and from their communities, and from their families, and from spaces they're in, I think that addresses it. It starts a conversation around it at the least.
Yeah. Wow, that's fast. I never thought of it like that. Ryan, you had said something about safe consumption sites, and as most of you, I think, know, about 3.5 years ago, Glide did a demonstration site for a safe consumption site in the basement of the church. And we are now one of the co-sponsors of SB 57, which is Senator Wiener's bill to have safe consumption sites as a pilot. For us, the science says it works. And again, at Glide, we're not about judging people. We're like, if this thing works, if this space works to get people to a better spot, then we want to be there for them. And so this is a shameless plug for all of you throughout the state of California or throughout the country that, there's 120 safe consumption sites in the world, and there has not been one person who has died. And we're trying to save people's lives. And so the science is there, it works. And so we're hoping that we're able to do it in California. And so if you're in the state, please get your legislator to support SB 57. Again, Glide.
And I would just,
uh-huh.
I would just like to add to that the safe consumption sites overdose prevention program, since Drug Policy Alliance has also been working on this issue for a while. We have the data, right? We know that these sites have been implemented in other parts of the world. And now we have two sites in New York City, right? They took leadership last year towards the end of November, opened the 2 sites, right? And in 3 weeks, in the first 3 weeks of operation, these programs reverse about 59 overdoses, right? And that just speaks volumes to the effectiveness of these programs, right? Those are 59 lives that were saved. Just wanted to say that, because, I think that, being able to provide people, right, with a safe space, non-judgmental, where they can come, right, do what they have to do, right, but they know that there's people who care about them, right? They know that they can come to a place where they can be, where they can receive resources, right? Things that they need to keep themselves safe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, Norma, there's 3 organizations that are co-sponsoring, and I believe you guys are also part of that. So thank you for your partnership on that. Let's see, going back to the questions, we have some great questions. Here's one. Says the so-called war on drugs has exacerbated racial divisions in American society and infringed on civil liberties. Black Lives Matter movement was inspired in part by cases that revealed a hostile attitude towards drugs among police. Some would say law enforcement continues to weaponize those who might actually have a substance use disorder. What should the Black Lives Matter movement advocate for next is one part of the question. Second is, should it just encourage more states to decriminalize the use of marijuana as a starting point, or simply take the fight to Washington, where the House of Representatives have passed the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, effectively decriminalizing the use of marijuana? So those 3 questions. You can answer all 3, or if you want to each pick one, we're open.
Hey, I'll just start real quick to say, as a white dude, I'm not going to tell the Black Lives Matter movement to do nothing, but I will be there next to you and behind you in solidarity.
Thank you, Ryan. Halston, Norma, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Halston.
I'll piggyback a few, Norma. I was going to ask you, Miguel, to read the question, part of the questions back to me, because it was eloquent, but it was pretty dense there.
Right. Okay. What should Black Lives Matter move to advocate for next? Should it just encourage more states to decriminalize the use of marijuana as a starting point, or simply take the fight to Washington, where the House of Representatives have passed the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, which would effectively decriminalize the use of marijuana? Norma, you want to go first?
I think that, and I think that this is more about community, right, and base building, right? in terms of what do we want to see instead of this war on drugs, right? Making sure that we are supporting policies that are putting the people's needs first, right? That policies that are backed by science, right? Like drug decriminalization, right? That's something that we are now starting to have conversations here in the United States. Portugal in 2001, they enacted drug decriminalization, right? They eliminated the penalties for possessing substances, right? And they also invested in harm reductions and treatment services. And here in the United States, right, in 2020, Oregon it was the first state to vote in favor and pass Measure 110 that decriminalized all drugs. Right, and not only did the measure 110 eliminated the penalties, just like Portugal, it also invested, right? It gave back to the community, making sure that people had access to housing, treatment, recovery centers, right? Harm reduction, and that really goes to show, right, that as some of these policies move forward, we need to be aware and be able to support them, right? Making sure, like you said, like making sure you're calling your legislator, right? Making sure that you are voicing your support for measures that are life affirming and it's gonna have that are gonna benefit our communities.
Right. Thank you, Norma. Halsted.
Yeah, I don't really feel qualified to answer that question, to be honest.
All right, no worries, no worries. We're all family here. All right, so the final question for tonight. This has been an awesome discussion. I think we almost need a part 2 to this, or part 3 and 4. But before we go to the final question, all of you, those of you who are listening and watching this, and as our panelists, we're all in this together, right? And so I hope this is not the last time we can engage. We hope that everyone signs up on Glide's website to get more information about the different programs that we work on and issues that we work not only by ourselves, but in partnerships with many others. We have housing and homelessness, and I see Sarah Short with us, who's a partner in that. Criminal justice reform. Many of you all have been a part of that as well. Women and children of color, obviously, is a big important thing to us. Food security. So, please, 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 we ask you to be part of the Glide family. And we want to thank those of you that have already been a part of it. So the last question is, what can we do to support restorative justice efforts for vulnerable people in communities affected by the war on drugs? So what can we do as folks? So we'd love your wisdom on that.
I think a lot of it boils down when we can have discussion, obviously, and intentions, but we live in a material world. And I think if we're not talking about redistribution of resources, we're not really talking about much. If we're not talking about conversations around land, if we're not talking about conversations around housing security, if we're not talking about conversations around reparations, as controversial as a discussion that is, then we're not really talking about much, because I think, all these conversations are intersectional and they're holistic, and they should be. So I think, fundamentally, we need to talk about putting resources, whether it's capital, whether it's land, whether it's funding for organizations that are doing work on the ground. We need to talk about moving money around, and what is the motor to compel that, right? Because we can ask and we can request it, and we can, but we need to build a base in a way that empowers us to demand, and not in a way that's posturing, right? In a way that's, we need this, we're taking this. And that's how I see it.
Thank you, Halsted.
And I would just add to that it's really important to also fight back, right? Fight back against harmful policies, right? That And just to provide an example, our policy office is co-sponsoring a piece of legislation, AB 2195. We're calling this the Alternate Plea Act. And this piece of legislation is in response to a damaging U.S. Supreme Court decision from last year that basically eliminated the last immigration neutral drug defense. Prior to this decision, a non-citizen was able to survive a plea to a drug charge in immigration proceedings. Because of this decision, because of this U.S. Supreme Court decision, a non-citizen now who is convicted of a drug offense is likely to face mandatory ICE detention and deportation. Right. So that goes to say that when talking about restoring the harms, right, we also need to start identifying the different ways that the drug war has contaminated the systems, right, and the different ways that it continues to perpetrate harm to our communities, right, and not even to people, right, because this drug war has also been exported beyond our borders, right. It's in Latin America, Central America, and Mexico, right, and so because of this, people are not only being forced to escape their home country, right? Once they're here and they consider this place their home, now they're also able send back home, right? So that just shows just the inhumanity that this drug war has caused.
Yeah. Thank you, Ryan.
I think we got to get back to promoting peace, right? Condemn war in all of its forms. How can we make it so that Fleet Week isn't so popular in San Francisco, right? Why is drugs such a problem in San Francisco? Well, why is wealth hoarding such a problem also in San Francisco? There's such social stratification that creates a lot of despair. And so, yes, in terms of restoration, land back, decolonization, absolutely redistribution of wealth. Abolish not only the prisons, but do we need to abolish America and just start over, right? Things to think about.
Wow. So that's a lot. And we appreciate all of you. And Halston, to your comments about having discussions, this past Tuesday, we had a forum such as this on reparations. And this fall, Glide is hosting a national convening on reparations. So please be on the lookout. Marnie, thank you. Harm reduction, let's say health management. You know what? That's actually a wonderful idea. Marnie, thank you from Larkin Street for suggesting that. I actually really like that. So I want to thank all of our panelists for giving us their time and their wisdom. This is medicine, being able to provide some ideas of what do we need to do to be healthy and to be alive and to thrive. And that's what these discussions are all about. I want to thank members of the Glide staff, Irby Foster. I want to thank Guled Hussein, who's our incredible manager of community engagement. I want to thank Hannah, who is our social justice coordinator, who helps us do all this good work. Thank you all for showing up. Thank you for listening. Thank you for giving us wisdom. Please be on our mailing list. We have these events monthly, and we're looking to when we get together and we can do these in person. So thank you all and have a wonderful and good night, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much for the space. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Peace, y'all. Love you, Glide.
Thank you.